Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Digging Deeper moment number 122. The mission of our Digging Deeper moments is to take God's Word to God's world, and we are so glad that you've joined us. Last week, we began a study called How to Understand the Prophets of the Old Testament. In our first lesson, we saw how the Hebrew is written, the language of the Old Testament, was written in a repetitive fashion, something called recursive progressivism. That is progressively repetitive. Normally, a Hebrew writer would begin a discourse on a particular topic, develop it from a particular angle or perspective, and end by closing down that conversation. Then he would begin another conversation, taking up the same topic again from a different perspective. This repetition occurs both on the macro and micro levels. Now, last week we saw that on the macro level, it occurs between two main genres. The two main genres of Hebrew, which are prose, that's when words are written and there's to be understood in their literal sense, just the way they're written, kind of like history is written. Historical narrative is prose. This happened, then that happened. There's no symbolism in the words. Just read them for what they mean. Then there's poetry, and these words are used in poetry. They have symbolic meaning, and we looked at this in chapters 4 and 5 of the book of Judges. Judges 4 is written in prose, straight out historical narrative, and chapter 5 of Judges is written in poetry. Both tell the same story from a different perspective, but by bringing those two stories together, we get a stereo-like experience and we get a fuller, richer sound. Let me just say that not only does this progressive repetitivism or this recursive progressivism do on the genre level and the chapter level, like in Judges 4 and 5, we also see it in chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis. This is important because the Bible starts right out with a repetitiveness. You know, some scholars believe that chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis tell two different stories of creation. Simply put, this is wrong. This is incorrect. And the reason they get it wrong is that they're applying what we consider to be normal thinking and writing methods of the 21st century to the Bible. But the Bible was written between 2,000 and 3,500 years ago, and we need to understand how they thought and how they wrote to understand what they wrote. Repetition is the normal pattern for Hebrew writing. And so Genesis 1 and chapter 2 tell the same story of creation, but from different perspectives. It's only by reading the two chapters together, like Judges 4 and 5, do we get the full story of creation. In fact, chapter 1 gives us the story of creation from the macro level, the big picture. And chapter 2 focuses on creation, the creation of the first man and first woman. So it's narrowing in, it's zooming in on Adam and Eve and the first two human beings. But only by putting these two pictures together, these two stories together, do we get the entire story. That's what we see in Judges 4 and 5. And it's also true on the book level of what we see in 1 Kings and 2 Kings and 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles. By bringing these stories together, we get to see the whole picture. But not only does Hebrew repeat itself on the macro level, it also repeats itself on the micro level. Peter Gentry writes in How to Understand the Biblical Prophets, almost all Hebrew poetry is based on the couplet, the minimum version of the left and right speakers to create a story of a three-dimensional idea. A couplet is a pair of two verses that form a unit. In the first line of Hebrew, or of a Hebrew couplet, the first represents the right speaker, and the second line represents the left speaker. This is also called parallelism. You can hear it, you'll read this in different literature. It's called parallelism. The first verse and the second verse are parallel to each other. And so the second line either repeats, adds to, or contradicts the first line in order to make the point. A good example of this is found in Isaiah chapter 5, verse 17. The NIV says, "The sheep will graze as in their own pastures. Lambs will feed among the ruins of the rich." Now these two lines say the same thing, but the second line adds detail. What the sheep call their own pasture in the first line will turn out to be the ruins of the rich. So what Isaiah is doing is he's announcing the coming of judgment. And so only by understanding the two lines do we fully understand what's being said. This is a couplet. These are two lines saying similar things or the same thing to give us a full picture. We see this in the New Testament. Jesus teaches us to pray in the Lord's Prayer in Matthew 6:9, and we have to remember Jesus thought and spoke in Aramaic, and he says, "In this manner, therefore pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." Now, when he says your kingdom come and your will be done, he's not talking about two different things. Your kingdom and God's will being done on earth is the same thing. This is Hebrew parallelism. This is progressive, recursive Hebrew thought, repeating the same thing differently to add detail. So we see that on the micro level, even in a sentence, we have repetition. But not only does Hebrew do couplets, it also does triplets. something called a tricola. Not a Pepsi Cola, a tricola. You know, this is triplets. This is doing things on the micro level 3 times. Isaiah chapter 1 verse 3 says the ox knows its owner, number 1, and the donkey knows its master's crib, number 2, but Israel does not know, my people do not consider, number 3. Notice that we have 3 repetitions of 3 ideas, but the last one is a couplet. So we have triplet and we have a couplet. Now, I'm not trying to get us too complicated, but what I do want us to begin to pay attention to is when you're reading the Old Testament, particularly prophetical or poetry material, you have to look at what's repeated to fully understand what's being said. We see it again in Isaiah chapter 1:4. We see couplets and a triplet again. We see it says, alas, a sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity. That's the first couplet. A brood of evildoers. Second part of that statement, children who are corrupters. Children who are corrupters explains what a brood of evildoers are. You can see that between children and brood. He's talking about family here. He's making a point. Then we have the third part of the triplet, which says they have forsaken the Lord, they have provoked the Holy One Israel, and they have turned away backwards. So now we have a triplet and a triplet. So what you can see here is that don't just think that these things are just done in a very uncreative way. This repetition gets done in a lot of different ways and in a lot of creative ways, but we have to recognize that Hebrew likes to repeat itself, and so they're not adding something totally new, they're adding new detail to what's already been stated. Okay? So just remember that this repetition can be used in various ways, and you'll get more familiar with it. You will actually begin to see it in a lot of different places. We even see triplets used amongst chapters. In Isaiah chapter 49 through 53, there are actually 3 songs, that's triplet, about the servant of Yahweh. This is typical Hebrew thinking and writing. In Isaiah chapter 49, verses 1 through 13, in Isaiah chapter 50, verses 4 through 11, and Isaiah 52, 13 through 53, 12. These are all talking about the servant of God or the servant of Yahweh. The point to remember is this. When reading the Bible, specifically the Old Testament, but as well as into the New Testament as well, you have to remember that the thinking behind what's written in the Bible is Hebraic. Therefore, expect to find repetitions on a macro and micro level. But that's all we have time for this week. If this lesson helped you, please share it with a friend, like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, subscribe to our YouTube channel, or check out our Sunday morning live podcast on either Apple or Spotify. And if you'd like to partner with us as we take God's Word to God's world, you can do so by going to our website and clicking the How to Give tab. I hope to see you next week.